spring when I was a kid, my family and I would go up to Yosemite Valley National Park. We would go to get away from it all, to experience the great outdoors. But most importantly, and seldom mentioned, we went up to remember my uncle, who died tragically in a mountain climbing accident there. For me, the place had a sacred reverence to it, with the enormous redwood trees scraping their way into the heavens, or the incredible mountain range towering above. It pressed upon me with a sense of awe and wonder. It gripped me even more so with terror and amazement. There's one stretch along the road as we're getting into Yosemite Valley, a tunnel, a dark tunnel, and as kids in the back of the truck, we would hold our breath until we got to the very end, and it was bursting upon the scene with brilliant, bright light. And before us was this picturesque landscape, mountain range, painted with trees, cascading waterfalls. And it filled us with so much terror and amazement. We saw how small we were, how insignificant we were. And at this moment, filled with this terror and amazement, and carrying this emotional weight, we could have made a decision to turn back and go home. But every spring, each year, though gripped by terror and by amazement, and carrying this emotional weight, we pressed on further. Today, as we celebrate Easter or Resurrection Sunday, we will explore the ending of the Gospel of Mark. We will encounter the story of 3 faithful women who have followed Jesus all throughout his earthly ministry. And here in this scene, the women are gripped by terror and amazement because something incredible has happened. Something groundbreaking, something earth-shattering, something death-defying has happened. But what will this terror and what will this amazement lead them to? To discipleship or to fear and lack of faith? Our text this morning is from Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. It's the earlier or the original ending to the Gospel of Mark. And it reads, "When Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. When they had been saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?' When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, 'Do not be alarmed, for you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you.' So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And so ends the Gospel of Mark, with no account of the resurrection appearance of Jesus. And you may say, well, my Bible has 12 more verses to go. What about verses 9 through 20? Well, 9 through 20 is a later addition to the Gospel that accounts for the resurrection appearance of Jesus. It was probably constructed in the 2nd century with a combination of material from the Gospels and also from the book of Acts. But both are important, and both are canonized for various purposes by the church. But today I want us to consider ending the Gospel of Mark where the earliest manuscripts end abruptly, with 3 women fleeing from the tomb in terror and amazement without having seen the resurrected Jesus. Verse 2 begins, "Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb." Now, the women didn't go to the tomb to witness the resurrection. They went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus, to apply spices and oils in a way to sort of mask the emitting odor and to preserve the body. This was an act of honor the last act of honor possible that they could give to Jesus. This act of paying respect and honor to Jesus would make them ritually and religiously unclean. Maybe you recall Numbers 19:11. Whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. What great determination and honor we see in these women. But at the same time, what great inability to comprehend what Jesus had said about his resurrection. But how can you blame them? Death in their socio-historical context was sovereign. It was all-powerful. It was the end of all things. There's no turning back. That's that. It's final. Death is permanent. When they arrived at the tomb, they saw that the stone was rolled back, and as they entered, they were startled to see a young man, or a divine being of sorts, dressed in white. They were gripped with fear. They were gripped with perhaps terror and amazement. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised." Or the Greek says, egerthe. Christian faith rests on this proclamation, egerthe, that he is risen, that Jesus has been risen from the state of death. The sovereign, the all-powerful, the no turning back, the final permanence of death has been shattered. And I've got a question to ask. Oh, death, where is your sting?
Yes.
Where is your sting? Because I can't feel it. I can't sense it. I can't taste it. I can't hear it. I can't see it, because all I can see, all that fills my space, is the glorious resurrection of Jesus. The light of a new dawning day that has broken upon the scene and shattered the strongholds of sin and death once and for all. The empty tomb, the resurrection, has emptied death of its power, of its terror. The empty tomb is a symbol that the resurrection of Jesus has overcome. And you know, some Christians like to wear crosses around their neck. I think in addition to the crosses, you might want to wear an empty tomb, because death has been emptied of its power. Resurrection is victory over the power of death and the fear that it injects into human life. The angelic being said to the women, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you." Now, sight is a recurring theme we see in the Gospel of Mark, and especially in our passage. As the mourning women approached the tomb, verse 4 expresses that they looked up and they saw that the stone had been rolled back. And in verse 5, as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man. In verse 6, the young man or angel said to the women, "Do not be alarmed, for you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified." Then he said, "Look, there is the place they laid Jesus." And then he instructed the women, "Tell Peter," in verse 7, "and the disciples that Jesus is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him." This repetition of sight, it works to communicate this urgency of seeing the physical, resurrected body of Jesus. But what's crazy is that the Gospel of Mark doesn't mention the women seeing Jesus. Instead, verse 8 shows that they went out and fled from the tomb for terror. The Greek says traumas, a trembling, quaking fear and amazement. Ecstasis is where we get the English word ecstatic. It means to be beside oneself, flabbergasted, or completely stupefied, overwhelmed, astonished, amazed. This quaking fear and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Think of a time when maybe you were amazed, or shocked, or astounded. What did it feel like? Was your heart racing? Were your hands shaking? What was going on inside of you? Standing on the valley floor, surrounded by towering trees and mountains in Yosemite, I can hardly barely manage to say one word. Maybe I can manage to say, whoa. Beyond that, I am silenced. Utterly silenced. Because I realize my inability. I realize my finiteness, my smallness. I am silenced by terror and amazement, just as the women were silenced by terror and amazement. But the important part to remember is the difference. My experience of terror and amazement has drawn me closer to, not further from. Terror and amazement silences the women, and it draws them away. It highlights the reality of their failure, their inability. And Mark shows us, just as the disciples failed, so too the women fail in relaying the message. And sure, they must have spilt the beans somewhere along the line and told the disciples or the people about the resurrected Jesus. But the author of Mark is expressing something very important here, that the ending is not resolved. The ending is not resolved because no one in the Gospel of Mark who has been with Jesus is willing to carry the message and continue his mission. In other words, can anyone be a faithful disciple of Jesus? The religious leaders, they rejected him. His family thought he was absolutely insane. The disciples fled and the women were silenced. But who remained in those events when everyone else left? In Gethsemane, when the disciples fell asleep, who stayed awake? In the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, who was there? At Peter's denial, who was there? When all the disciples fled, when Jesus was upon the cross, who was there? When the women were silenced, who was there? The reader was there. The gospel ends abruptly as the narrator breaks off the story and leaves the readers who may have thought that this story is about someone else with a decision to make. Will we follow Jesus? Will we carry the message and continue his mission? Will the terror and amazement that we experience draw us into a life of discipleship, or to diminish into lack of faith? Will we, though not having seen the resurrected Jesus, be able to pursue a life of discipleship, even in the midst of terror and amazement? Is it possible? Absolutely. Because faith and conversion and discipleship do not rest on resurrection appearances, but on the word of promise, the victory over death, at the very moment when death seemed sovereign and all-powerful. The ending is abruptly open for you and I, because the ending involves us. We participate in the good news and in sharing the message of salvation and victory to all. For there is an unwritten page left for each of us to write about what Jesus has done in us and through us. Would you pray with me? Lord, help us to be faithful, to see the awe and wonder of your resurrection, and to follow you all the days of our lives. Forgive us for our lack of faith, and embolden us for the road ahead. Though we may walk through terror, help us to be amazed at your goodness and your steadfast love. We give you all praise in Jesus' name.